Breaking news concerning the U.S. economy.
And it's gone.
What?
It's gone. It's all gone.
Not socialism.
All right, let's not panic.
And it's gone.
I'll make the money back by selling one of my livers. I can get by with one.
Government should be a partner. Partner.
I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I'm really rich.
And it's gone. Gone.
Hey everyone, welcome to this edition of the Global Crypto Podcast with Luno. I'm James Preston, and in this edition we have Andreas Antonopoulos, of course, one of the most well-known communicators of Bitcoin and decentralized blockchains. He is an extraordinary mind and was a computer scientist, or well, is a computer scientist, but gave up his career to go all in on blockchain technology, on Bitcoin, on its ideologies, and in this interview actually says that his favorite philosopher is Satoshi Nakamoto. So it is a wonderful, meandering conversation and dialogue about Bitcoin, what it means for society, and of course, where this all could go. So enjoy it. I'm sure you will. Please share it with your friends, with family, and make sure that you're subscribed to us on YouTube and in the various podcast platforms. We sincerely appreciate all the support that we can get. Just before we get into this week's episode, you may wonder about my point about Andreas's hairstyle. That's actually a reference to one of his recent videos on his YouTube channel, where he started a series called Down the Rabbit Hole, where he asks himself a question, and in a typically satirical fashion, he comments to himself that his hairstyle is looking particularly fierce, as you can see in this clip here.
The idea is really simple. I ask myself a question and then I answer it. So it's not a question from the audience. It's not a question from the community builders. It's not a question from the chat. It's a question from me. Hey, Andreas, love your work. Thank you so much, man. By the way, I really like your hairstyle right now. It's looking particularly fierce. Here's my question.
So that's what that little comment is about. Before we get into the chat, let's hear from our sponsors, Luno.
For fast local bank deposits and withdrawals, advanced charting tools, and API access for automated trading, sign up with Luno, Africa's most trusted, secure, and reliable crypto exchange. Go to www.luno.com or download the Luno app. Ranked in the global top 10 exchanges by Crypto Compare. T's and C's apply. Cryptocurrencies are volatile and unpredictable. Never risk more than you're willing to lose.
He is one of the earliest public advocates for Bitcoin, the author of multiple volumes, university lecturer, computer scientist, and has arguably done more for the space than anyone else besides the original Bitcoin developers themselves. I give you Mr. Andreas Antonopoulos. Andreas, we really love your hairstyle. It's looking incredibly fierce today. Welcome to the Global Crypto Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on, James. It's a real pleasure. Although, if I would argue against the proposition that I've done more than many others in the space, but you flatter me. Thank you so much.
Well, Andreas, we certainly believe you are one of the leading proponents and evangelists of Bitcoin and decentralized crypto assets. So we appreciate all the work you're doing. Just want to start by asking about the geopolitical climate the world finds itself in right now. You've spoken before about the need for money as we know it to break. Mm-hmm. Do you think this COVID-19 crisis is the catalyst for that to happen?
Yeah, I don't think I've said it exactly that way, but because I think that money as we know it is already broken. And I don't want it to break anymore. It's just that it doesn't currently serve billions of people who are left outside the system, who don't have access to financial services, or who are consistently put at a disadvantage because of a system that is geared towards serving the needs of the rich and powerful repeatedly over the needs of the middle class. And the pandemic, in my opinion, isn't the cause of the depression we're seeing. We were well overdue for a recession because in 2008, during the global financial crisis, none of the problems were fixed. And directing stimulus through central banks and using the banks to distribute funds to big businesses only serves to exaggerate inequality. And effectively, it's taking from future earnings of the middle class in order to prop up the investment portfolio of those who already have significant advantage. And to me, that's criminal. So the system we have is already broken. And I think that what the pandemic has done is it's revealed the fragility and inequality that is baked into the system. And once again, the middle class and the lower part of the economic scale is getting brutalized in order to protect the investments and to de-risk the investments of the rich and powerful. And that's criminal.
How do you see this current geopolitical climate and crisis around the world, especially, of course, the uprisings that we're seeing in the USA at the moment, but there certainly seems to be something bubbling under the surface globally. How do you see this all playing out?
Well, this is where I battle between my optimistic perspective of the world and my desire to see improvement versus often a more pessimist perspective that comes from seeing what's actually happening on a daily basis. We're seeing a lot of unrest around the world, and the reason we're seeing that is really, in my mind, very straightforward. People have had enough. They've had enough of injustice and unequal access and lack of opportunity. And in the case of the US, all of that plus extreme police brutality, militarization, and constant abuse, oppression, degradation of people by the police. And then the final cherry on top, if you like, to add insult to injury, after we repeatedly see elements of police brutality and murder, there are almost never consequences. And the consequences, if any, are mild. So that's an unsustainable situation. There are, we either fix things and introduce massive reform to fix the broken aspects of the system that create such injustice, or we end up with a system where that injustice is cemented into a structural system of oppression. And, I don't want to see a world in which those who have the means, which is going to be increasingly a smaller and smaller and smaller percentage of the population because it's going to get more and more expensive to buy safety, will retreat behind high walls and barbed wire and electrified fences, while outside of these walls, the vast majority of humanity is consistently brutalized and treated with injustice on a daily basis to keep them from complaining. I don't want to see a world like that. I don't want to see the kind of inequality that leads to this social divide that, as I mentioned before, I've seen in many countries. We need to move in the opposite direction. And so I hear a lot of people who are very much in favor of having law and order. And the desire for order without an appeal to justice is a fool's game. If you expect to see order and you don't have justice, you don't have reform, and you just hope that a slightly greater dose of violence will stop the disorder you're seeing in society around you, that's not going to happen. You're just going to end up in a situation where violence is what happens every day and injustice increases. The only way to have order and peace is to deliver justice, and that means reforming systems that are broken. Money is just the starting point. And Vitalik Buterin made a tweet recently which was a very important point, which says this isn't just about reforming money. Reforming money should be just a starting point. We need to be thinking about reforming the governance systems of society, because what we have today is broken. It's better than what we had in the past, granted. It's better than a feudal system. It's better than apartheid. It's better than many of the things we had in the past, but it's not good enough. And so we need to reform all systems of governance, not just money.
That brings me perfectly into the very next question, which is that the current problem with socio-political structures today is its architecture. The architecture is constructed in a hierarchical pyramid. Democracy is only 2,500 years old. What, in your opinion, is a better architecture? Are there any philosophers, socio-political commentators, or other authors who have proposed ideas that you're interested in?
Yes, absolutely. My idea of an alternative architecture is one that is flat, or at least much flatter than what we have today, and less hierarchical. Now, hierarchy serves a purpose, and the purpose is to scale. So you can't scale decision-making if everybody has an equal say. So we use representative democracy in order to scale democracy. Otherwise, you have to restrict who has a say. So in ancient Athens, where we invented democracy, as long as you were male, a landowner, and a citizen, you had a voice. Everybody else didn't have a voice. And that meant you could get everybody in the city of Athens in one place and have them shout it out, and it worked. We can't do that with the modern version of democracy. We have this hierarchical mechanism of representative democracy. So how do you scale better? My favorite philosopher on this topic is Satoshi Nakamoto. And the approach used there is to create a system of rules without rulers that allows everybody to participate over a network, using the internet as a mechanism for trust, and building a platform that allows us to trust in the software to enforce the rules, and then it allows everybody to participate on a voluntary basis with that set of rules. And if you don't like them, you select a different piece of software with a different set of rules. So that's the mechanism, and it offers a much more flat model of governance. It's not perfect. It's not perfectly flat either, but it's better than what we have today, and it scales better than what we have today in some circumstances. So I think that the invention of these decentralized network-based systems of trust gets us closer to an ideal environment by making things more equitable.
And that leads into what you've said before about tribalism being part of human nature. And then, of course, I mean, we've seen that very much in the blockchain industry and in our ecosystem. Tribalism is so rife, especially with the Bitcoin maximalist narrative. Your follow-up book to Mastering Bitcoin was Mastering Ethereum. There's obviously a lot of debate from many intelligent people like yourself who argue, well, I mean, you don't argue that there's no room for dApps, but there are many intelligent people who do argue that there is no room for dApp platforms like Ethereum. What are your views on what is known as Bitcoin maximalism?
Well, I think it's a very narrow perspective, and I think it primarily comes from a fear that Bitcoin doesn't stand on its own and it needs to be defended by gatekeepers who have to reject any alternative effort to try something in parallel, that the ecosystem must be narrowly focused on only one aspect. I think a lot of that also comes from a monetary and economic perspective rather than a software engineer perspective. And I come from the software side, and I see this as a broad ecosystem of protocols where competition should be encouraged and nurtured, and where we should allow people to voluntarily choose which protocol they think is suitable for the application they're building, and accept the results of the market on that. And so far, I think the market has quite clearly spoken to the fact that there is, in fact, room for different approaches, that experimentation across the board leads to more innovation, more openness, and better results. And that while Bitcoin is the best way to do some things, it's not the best way to do everything. And vice versa, the same thing applies to Ethereum and other platforms. It's not just Bitcoin maximalists. You've got to realize that, first of all, that term was created derisively by Vitalik Buterin. But there's an equal number of Ethereum maximalists who claim that all you have to do is use Ethereum, and you can simply abstract Bitcoin and wrap it as a ERC20 token, and you don't need Bitcoin because Ethereum can do everything. I disagree with that position equally. It can't. So I believe that when designing protocols, when designing technological systems like these, there are a number of choices that come up, and these choices necessarily involve trade-offs. And these trade-offs necessarily mean that if you do something well, you have to not do something else well. You can't just be a jack of all trades. And the protocols that have tried to be undifferentiated than a jack of all trades really end up getting even less traction because they lack focus. Bitcoin has focus. It is focused on sound money, robust security, and resistance to censorship on a global scale, even against motivated and well-funded adversaries, including nation states. That's a niche that Bitcoin has thoroughly occupied. But every choice that leads it to be focused and thoroughly occupying that niche makes it less useful for the kind of flexible and expressive smart contracts that you need to do some other things. And it also slows down the rate of innovation and progress because it has to be very conservatively managed. And in that other niche, I think Ethereum has done a very good job of presenting some alternative approaches. I don't see any reason why we should exclude that perspective, or certainly no reason why I personally shouldn't satisfy my intellectual curiosity by reading about and learning about other things. And keep in mind, writing a book, Mastering Ethereum, it's mastering Ethereum from a computer science perspective. This is a software engineering university-level textbook. This is not mastering Ethereum investments. And I certainly haven't ever recommended any platform for investment. I'm not interested in the investment side, and that's not my area of expertise. It's mastering Ethereum as a software platform, and in fact, it applies to any virtual machine-based blockchain, including Rootstock, which is a side chain to Bitcoin. So, I don't buy maximalism, honestly.
We're going to take a short break to hear from our sponsors. We'll be back in about 45 seconds.
There's so much more to cryptocurrency than just trading. With Luno's industry-leading crypto wallet and exchange, not only can you buy and sell the main cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ethereum, and XRP, you're also given world-class security and a wealth of knowledge. Luno offers free crypto education and some of the most detailed market analysis every week. Sign up today with the safe and easy way to buy, store, and learn about cryptocurrency. Go to www.luno.com or download the Luno app on iOS and Android. Luno is ranked in the global top 10 exchanges by CryptoCompare. T's and C's apply. Cryptocurrencies are volatile and unpredictable. Never risk more than you're willing to lose.
All right, we're back. So let's talk about your history as an IT security specialist. Take us back to the moment you first heard about Bitcoin. It must have been quite an exciting ordeal. Could you just tell us about your penny drop moment in Bitcoin?
Well, that would actually be the second time I heard about Bitcoin, because the first time I heard about Bitcoin, and I vaguely remember hearing about it sometime in 2011, maybe earlier, I'm not sure. And it was in relation to a gambling site. And I instantly dismissed it because I was not interested in gambling and I didn't understand what Bitcoin was. I had seen many examples of various efforts to build various forms of online money, all of which were centralized and not particularly interesting. And I assumed that's what Bitcoin was. The second time I heard about it was later, in 2012, and this time the article that I read had a link to the white paper, and for some reason, out of curiosity, I clicked on it and started reading, and it completely blew my mind, derailed my career, derailed my life, really, and sent me down this rabbit hole and chasing as much information as I could get on this. And the reason for that was quite simple. My background as a computer scientist working in distributed systems and information security had all of the necessary prerequisites, if you like. I was primed for certain kinds of information, and Bitcoin just pushed all those buttons simultaneously. And I'd been involved in the cypherpunk community. I had been following applied cryptography and cryptography mailing lists for years and years, and many, many efforts previous to that to build digital cryptographic money. And so I was really, really interested in this approach. And once I read about it, I became persuaded that this would be radically different from what came before and would have an enormous impact, and I decided to focus on it.
Now, it could be argued that Bitcoin has already won in terms of success versus failure, but perhaps just a bit of pontification here. What would, in your opinion, be the biggest win for Bitcoin? Would it be a government adopting it? Would it be a libertarian state like a Liberland getting granted its own geopolitical jurisdiction? Would it be something else?
Well, for as many people who argue that Bitcoin has won, another huge number of people will argue that it's already dead. And that argument really is irrelevant to Bitcoin's success. I certainly don't think that adoption by a nation state or even an unorganized community of libertarians means anything at all, because this isn't a state-level institution. It is the antithesis of state-level institutions. So it doesn't matter whether governments adopt it or even whether governments denounce it and try to ban it. None of that matters. What matters is whether people use it as a mechanism to secure their own independence and empower themselves in a global environment, if they use it as a financial mechanism of personal empowerment. And I think people are already doing that in small numbers and in places where the desperate need they have for financial empowerment overrides the very steep learning curve and difficulty in acquiring the knowledge and the currency itself, the Bitcoin currency. And in those places, they are adopting it. It's not a huge number of people, but that's not the measure of success. The measure of success is not everybody using Bitcoin. The measure of success is those who need Bitcoin because their alternatives are dire and centralized and controlled and censored and surveilled. Have the ability to use it in order to give themselves power, not use it instead of, but use it as well as other systems that exist out there, and potentially expanding to other blockchains or even other systems built on top of Bitcoin to gain power in other areas of societal governance, not just money. But to me, success is the opportunity to use it by more and more people and to make it easy to use and easy to use securely and to give people an option they didn't have before. And in that manner, I think Bitcoin is already succeeding, but it has a long way to go.
You spoke earlier about your natural tendency towards being optimistic, but circumstances around us naturally tend to make us feel a little bit more pessimistic. And it could be argued that the world is heading towards a dystopian future, much like those imagined by George Orwell or Ray Bradbury. Where do you stand right now in your perspective of the future? Do you remain an optimist?
Well, I think actually our dystopia is more Huxleyan after Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. Because it's not about suppression of information, it's about being fed a steady stream of entertainment garbage and palliative information and infotainment to distract us from truth, which seems to be a more effective mechanism of control and censorship, is to create a lot of noise that is entertaining. I don't know whether we can fix that. And I don't know whether we can use technology to fix that, but I am optimistic in one way, and that is that a lot of the problems we're seeing today seem to me to be most strongly felt in an older generation that does not have the life skills related to technology in order to be able to filter and discern truth and manage social media the way a younger generation does. So, whether it's in the United States or other places around the world, the people who are falling prey to massive bot disinformation campaigns and bullshit that's flying around Facebook and other platforms like that are mostly people in their 60s and above, who didn't have the life experience of managing information flows, who grew up in an environment where authoritative information came from a few authoritative sources, and therefore the source gave authority to the information. And once that was stripped away, then they found themselves unable to really validate truth. I think a younger generation that has grown up on the internet, however, has developed much better information sorting and filtering capabilities because of that exposure. So I will continue to be an optimist. I'll be an optimist because I believe that younger people are able to use these platforms and not be abused by them.
Now, for us here in South Africa, an emerging market like so many of the others that you described from your travels, and these emerging markets very much do seem like they're on their knees in light of this global economy addicted to GDP growth. What advice can you give to people living in emerging markets like this? How can they protect themselves from the likely economic depression which this pandemic is wreaking, or at least revealing globally in these markets?
That's a really difficult question, James. Honestly, I don't think I'm qualified to give advice on that topic because I don't live in these emerging markets. And the answer is very specific to the environment in which one finds themselves. So I think it's more important to foster education and skills-based learning all around the world in as many languages as possible. And that's the primary effort that I engage in. Because at the end of the day, those answers are going to have a distinctly local quality, and they're going to come from people within that community who are facing these problems. Just like we talked about before, these hierarchical institutions, one of the problems they have is that the people who are making decisions or offering advice, who are already successful within the existing system, don't have insight into the problems that are occurring very far away. That's why they make poor decisions, and can't really offer any advice because they represent the kind of survivorship bias of those who succeed within the existing system and can't really see what happens outside of it. So the only advice I can offer, which is consistent with my mission, is to develop education about these technologies in as many languages as possible, make that relevant to the people there, and build local communities that can take that and build that education and extend it, and make it more suitable to the problems that are being faced in the local community. I don't know anything about those problems. I don't face those problems on a day-to-day basis. I'm much more reliant on systems that already exist. So others will have to continue this work on a local basis.
All right. And just bringing this in for a close, Andreas, we ask our guests at the end of each interview to ask a guest who is scheduled for the next week, the following week, to ask a question. So last week we had Joe Lubin, of course, from Consensus, and we asked him to ask you a question. And Joe Lubin asks this.
Andreas is awesome. He's a great mind. And yeah, we've had a couple of good conversations, but mostly enjoy listening to him. I would say, philosophically, which ecosystem maps onto his sensibilities best? Would it be Tron, or Bitcoin, or Ethereum, or Fabric?
Oh boy, is that a loaded question. I would have to say it's Bitcoin, but not exclusively, because I see multiple opportunities for other systems to add enormous innovation to the space. So Bitcoin aligns most closely, but that doesn't mean my interest lies only there.
And then if you could please ask our next guest a question, our next guest being Arthur Hayes, of course, of BitMEX. What would you like to ask him?
Oh, that's interesting. So I've heard, and I don't know about this, but I've heard that BitMEX has a rather robust analytics and research arm that is independent of the exchange. And that seems like a difficult balance to strike, which is how do you create within a single organization two sides that maintain independence, and where one side can do research that may be in conflict with the interests of the other side of the organization. That's a challenge that exists in many organizations. And I'm interested to hear how BitMEX attempts to solve that. They seem to be doing a decent job, because I have heard that their research is of high quality, but I'd like to hear more about how they structure that.
And final question here on this show, Andreas. You talk about not being able to read some of BitMEX's research, which personally I have read. It's really outstanding. Where do you spend most of your time reading? Who are you reading?
Oh boy. For the most part, I'm reading the technology stuff directly. So I'm reading the Bitcoin and Lightning mailing lists. I'm reading various Ethereum developer transcripts and mailing lists from governance meetings. I'm reading newsletters that collect and aggregate that information. So for example, the Bitcoin Optech newsletter, which is a superb effort that collects information about what's happening in the technology space, purely technology. The Ethereum Weekly newsletter by Evan Ness, which is also very good at collecting that information. And I also read the source codes. You know, I look at GitHub pull requests and issues that come up in various platforms, and I read that in order to understand what's actually happening by the developers of these various platforms. And it's not just Bitcoin, Lightning, and Ethereum. I have a broad range of topics that I'm interested in, and I look at projects that offer me additional knowledge in those spaces. As you probably know, I'm very interested in privacy, so I also read about things that are happening in Monero and Zcash and Mimblewimble, for example, and a lot of these other platforms, as well as identity and identity platforms.
Wow. Well, Andreas Antonopoulos, everybody, what an incredible interview. What a privilege having you chat to us on this show. Thank you. And we wish you all the best as you continue your mission to evangelize the world with the message of a decentralized and sovereign economic system.
Well, thank you so much, James, for having me on the show, and great questions. I really appreciate your time and effort for this.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye. And there we go. That's where we leave it for this edition of the Global Crypto Podcast with Luno. What a marvelous conversation with a fantastic mind. Andreas Antonopoulos really is one of those minds that provokes you to think about the future and what is possible. Please won't you subscribe right here on YouTube or in your favorite podcasting app. If you would be so kind as to write a review for us in the podcasting apps like Apple or on Spotify, it of course helps us in reaching as many people as possible. And of course, if you haven't opened up an account with Luno, simply head over to www.luno.com, one of the most secure and trusted cryptocurrency wallets and exchanges. Check them out, luno.com. Next week, we have Arthur Hayes of BitMEX. That is going to be phenomenal. Stick around and keep it locked to Global Crypto. We'll catch you in the next edition. Cheers.
If I have trillions more dollars chasing a finite amount of assets, they go up. If I have 80% activity in an economy, I have a lot of people going out of business. So the question is, I like to trade on the side of math because predicting politics in the central banks, it's a very difficult thing to do correctly well over time. But the problem with math is it takes a very long time for you to be right.
Breaking news concerning the U.S. economy.
And it's gone.
What?
It's gone. It's all gone.
Not socialism.
All right, let's not panic.
And it's gone.
I'll make the money back by selling one of my livers. I can get by with one.
Government should be a partner. Partner.
I don't need anybody's money. It's nice. I'm really rich.
And it's gone. Gone.